Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. Okay, on this episode, I am talking with Charles Murray. Charles is the F.A. Hayek Chair Emeritus in Cultural Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He is a political scientist, and he is the author of numerous books, including, but not limited to, The Bell Curve, with the late Dick Herrnstein, Coming Apart, Human Diversity, and Facing Reality. I was fortunate enough to be able to have a conversation with Charles, and obviously many folks that will talk with Charles, there's obviously some controversy that kind of surrounds him, and so I wanted to kind of give some of my reasons and why I chose to talk with Charles and why we talked about some of the topics we discuss. I think that the whole point of having dialogue or having conversations in general is to learn something from someone, especially if they're coming from good faith. Charles is a scholar. He's done lots of stats. He's done lots of research. He's well published. And I had the opportunity to talk to him, and I wanted to hear his perspective. I did not treat Charles any different than I have from the 79 other guests on the previous episodes. And I hope that comes through. I don't do gotcha interviews, but I don't do softball questions and softball interviews, right? I wanted to give him a chance to get the best version of himself and his arguments and his position in dialogue with me. The way I structured the conversation was intentional. I'd say the first, hour of this 90 minutes, was definitely the first 40 minutes is just really a review of stats. That might be boring for some people, but I wanted to give context. Some people will just jump to the, data on race and IQ, and there's no context. And so I wanted to try and give that. I wanted to do that considering my own background, having a doctorate of psychology, having given many intelligence tests, doing, many clinical hours and training and things like that with intelligence tests. I wanted to try and have that conversation with him in that way. I don't agree with Charles on everything. I don't agree with any of my guests on everything. I do agree with him on some of the science, which is what most folks in clinical psych or in social psych or in sociology, many folks agree with him. What's in the psychological literature? There's to a point where many folks will agree with some of the data. I do have disagreements with him, but I think the point here is is somebody able to have a conversation when you agree or disagree? How do you do it in good faith? And again, trying to understand the person's perspective. This podcast is not to just have people I agree with. It's not to just have easy conversations. I recognize that these topics are controversial. I recognize that for some people, they may feel offended. I recognize they may feel some kind of pain. And that did not get missed on me. I tried very hard to ask him questions and formulate the conversation in a way that, again, got the best version of himself, but also considerate of some of the criticism. Again, if the listener can listen to these 90 minutes and walk away understanding his perspective and where he's coming from a little bit better, I will feel very good about this conversation. I feel proud of it already because that's what I was trying to do. People may agree or disagree with him regardless. That's fine. But I hope that the conversation allows folks to be able to say, I still don't agree with him, but I understand a little bit better. That will, in my mind, be a very successful response. So as I said, we start by talking about the statistical overview of the actual bell curve, not the book, the bell curve, statistical measure, and standard deviations. We talk about the overlap of group mean averages. We talk about meta-analyses and factor analyses and how they function and work and how they're important to IQ data. We talk about G and its importance. We talk a little bit about norming with IQ test. We talk about the terms race, ethnicity, population, and how we define that. We talk a little bit of genetics, SNPs, alleles, polygenetic index scores, etc. He outlines the data on race and IQ. We talk about why should we study group differences of IQ between race. We talk about some of the current social ideology and contributions to these conversations. We talk about genes and their interaction with the environment. We talk about what to do about racist groups that try to use race data for nefarious reasons. And end a little bit with some of his response to his criticisms. I can say that Charles treated me very kindly, and he was very affable with me. He answered all of my questions, and he was very polite. And he recognized that this would be a hard conversation, and I also recognize that. I think that we need to have more tough conversations in good faith, considering criticisms, considering hurt and pain that some of this stuff might cause people. That's important to acknowledge, but to also acknowledge, hey, here's some of the data, and everyone's going to have different opinions about the applied notion of data, and that's fine. It's fine to have those conversations. But again, my aim was to have the best version of his argument and his perspective, and I'd be curious to hear any feedback about the conversation. So now I bring you Charles Murray. All right, I'm here with the infamous Charles Murray. Very good to have you on, sir. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. You did choose the right word. I'm sorry in circles, I know.
Yeah.
And by the way, you're going to take a lot of flack for having me on the show.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, right? The thing about it is I think we have to have conversations. I think we have to have hard conversations. And I think we need to do it with good intentions, right? Yep. I don't have any animus towards anybody. I'm not doing gotcha stuff and trying to prove people wrong, but I want to have conversations about ideas, about things that we're talking about. And yeah, people will be upset or they'll applaud it or in between, and that's okay. But I hope that if people listen, they can judge the conversation by the content of what we say and not anything else aside from that. So that's my aim. So, okay. So you've written a few books. You've written The Bell Curve, which is kind of what got you some notoriety. You've written Coming Apart. You've written Human Diversity, and your new one, Facing Reality: Two Truths About Race in America. Just as kind of a particular way, I mean, what does it feel like to have, so many, I know you've written other stuff too, but what does it feel like to have so many books written at this point about, very similar topics? You're talking about many of the political things in the world. You're talking about society in America. You're talking about intelligence. You're talking about many, 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 many things. At this point, where do you kind of, I guess, and take stock in all of the things that you've written and the things that you've said as in the whole corpus of it?
Well, that's an especially hard question because what we're going through right now is unlike anything I've seen in my lifetime. I think that the nature of the crisis of polarization that we are in right now, and specifically the nature of the advocacy of identity politics, is not something that other topics like IQ or social structure and stratification and those things, I've been working with those a long time. I know an awful lot of the data. I'm really familiar with that. What we're looking at right now is in many ways, for me, terra incognita, and I'm trying to feel my way through it, and I'm not at all confident my crystal ball is still working.
Yeah, I think that at the moment we have many challenges, and it's interesting that you say that there's not a whole lot of that in your lifetime you haven't seen stuff like this. I know that if you've been working professionally in writing since at least the 70s, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
So
I've had books published in 5 decades. So.
Yeah, I mean that's quite a feat. It's quite an achievement. So yeah, it is interesting. I think that from what I understand, your new book has tried to tackle some of that. So which we definitely want to get to. So okay, I want to talk about many of the things that you've written about. And so before I do, I think it might be helpful to start out with some of the stuff that may be kind of boring for many people, which is talking about stats. So this is why I want to start with this. My understanding of many of the things that you talk about makes sense to me in terms of understanding the arguments. When I see people online, when I see op-eds written, when I see reaction pieces written about your stuff, much of the time, whether they agree with it, they disagree with it, that's irrelevant. I see a lot of people have some misunderstandings about statistics, and especially when you're talking about standard deviations, the bell curve, etc. You need more than just a cursory understanding of stats. I think you need a little bit more. And now in your books, you do a really, really nice job, usually in the appendices of kind of saying, okay, here's just kind of a primer on stats. And I think that's really helpful. But I think before we hit any of these big topics that are, in some circles controversial, it might be helpful to just kind of give an overview. So maybe we can start with the particulars, what's relevant for the research on intelligence and everything else. So start us out and walk us through the bell curve. What is, not the book, the actual bell curve. What is, what is this? Why is it important? And then we'll see how it applies for all the content.
Okay, the jargon goes like this. Standard deviation, you hear it all the time. It refers to how spread out scores are. You can think of a standard deviation, it's not quite mathematically correct, but close enough, as the average distance of any given observation from the mean. So if you're looking at height and you have the entire population, your height is going to go from the height of an average baby to 7'6" or whatever. And that standard deviation is going to be way bigger than the standard deviation in NBA basketball players. It's going to be much more compressed. Standard deviation is useful because it lets you compare apples and oranges. So that suppose you're talking about income and IQ scores, and those are two very different things. But you can say if somebody is one standard deviation among the mean in income, that means that they are at the 84th percentile of the distribution. So percentile is a term most people are familiar with. And you can also say of somebody who is the one standard deviation above the mean in intelligence, they're at the 84th percentile of intelligence. So you have kind of a common measuring stick for two completely different topics. That's useful. And it also provides kind of a, people will talk about a one standard deviation difference in IQ. That's a common, if you hear that. Is that big, small, or medium? It's kind of medium large. So that one standard deviation, if blacks are one standard deviation lower than whites, that means the average black is at the 16th percentile of the white distribution. Okay, so it's a shorthand, useful shorthand.
Yeah.
The thing that I find, and the frequency distribution, which makes up the bell curve, the bell-shaped curve, is simply the number of people in your sample who have a given score. So let's go back to height. And you have a sample of 1,000 people, of males, let's say, to make it easy. An awful lot of those males are going to be clustered between 5'9" and 5'11". And so there'll be a big peak, and the number of people at lower and higher heights is going to get smaller and smaller. Voila, bell-shaped curve. But distributions don't have to be bell-shaped. The distribution of the number of majors won by professional golfers who have won at least one PGA tournament is 1. Okay, that's the tallest number, and then the percentage that's won 2 majors is way smaller than that, and it gets so that curve just slopes its highest point is at the left-hand side, and it slopes down steeply. So that's standard deviation, that's frequency distribution. Most traits, most behavioral and cognitive and physical traits are shaped normally bell curve. Most people are sort of at the middle. The extremes are rare. The thing that I find hardest when talking about differences in population groups is people think instinctively that a difference in means sorts people into two bins.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they would say that if I put it so bluntly, but they sort of think of it that way, that if Asians and whites have a different mean in IQ, for example, that doesn't mean that all Asians are smarter than all whites. On the contrary, the overlap is great. So you have a mean for a standard use for a bell curve, for a normal distribution, but they overlap. That's true of blacks and whites, Asians and whites, everybody. And so millions of people in the lower scoring group are smarter than millions of people in the higher scoring group. That kind of thing is very hard for people to grasp intuitively.
Yeah, I think the overlap is important because we're saying, again, we're talking about averages, right?
Yeah.
An average is not, there's obviously, in terms of IQ, there's going to be some folks smarter than other people. Just because you're in a group that the average is this, that does not translate to an individual is going to be determined or resigned to this number. So if, for whites, the average IQ is 103 or whatever, 105, whatever it is, that doesn't mean that most, every single white person is going to have an IQ of 103. There's plenty of people that are going to have it lower, higher, etc. But yes, I think you're right that there's the shorthand is, I think, a way to understand it. And we do this because it's, when you're trying to do it in terms of scale, you're trying to look at large amounts of people. You can't just look at every single person, obviously. You're talking millions of people. So you need a shorthand to say, here's the average, here's where it all kind of, shakes out. And then you can make some inferences based off of that.
Yeah, if there's going to be a leitmotif to this conversation, because I'll come back to it as often as I have to. We are talking about social implications of differences in means, not implications for how you should react to a given individual that's standing next to you. You are going to learn vastly more about that individual's beauty, charm, intelligence, conscientiousness, any other trait by talking to the person for 10 minutes than you are going to find out from any personality test or IQ test or anything else.
Sure.
And you've got to treat people as individuals. That is the core, in my view, what the core ideal of the American experiment. And the only importance of differences in means or differences in race is social implications when you're talking about large numbers of people.
Yeah. So just before we leave the stats piece of it, and we might mention other things as we go along, but one of the things that comes up a lot in the scientific literature for intelligence and other constructs is what we've talked about a little bit is some of the descriptive stuff, but then you get to what we call inferential statistics, which is how do we, are able to use certain tests to understand the data that's there. And so some of this is factor analyses and meta-analyses. And so maybe just give us like the snapshot of what both of those are, because it will be relevant later.
It's a lot easier to do that with meta-analyses than factor analyses. Meta-analyses, it's a good example is IQ standardizations, of which, as you pointed out to me in our correspondence, their samples aren't all that big, especially for minorities. And can you really be confident that we're looking at stable, reliable estimates? And the answer is no, not for any one of these IQ standardizations. The samples of blacks are usually in the hundreds and not even the high hundreds. Same goes for Latinos. Asian samples are even smaller. But a meta-analysis is not simply a literature review. A meta-analysis combines all of these different studies using some very abstruse methods for making them comparable. I am not myself someone who's ever practiced meta-analysis, but it's a pretty highly developed methodology. And the simple way of thinking of it is you've got all of these separate results and you have a lot more statistical power if you can combine them.
Right.
Factor analysis is probably easy, at least you can understand what factor analysis is trying to do by going back to the invention of it. It was invented in order to explain an observation that was made back in the early 1900s, which is that Charles Spearman, I guess it was, that no matter what the test is, mental test is, that the scores that people get in different tests are correlated. It can be a geography test and a history test or the rest, but they tend to be correlated.
Yeah.
And so Spearman asked, why are these correlations exist? Because why should somebody get a good score in both of those? And he said, well, the correlations reflect some underlying general mental capability. And he came up with the label G for general, which of course has since become famous. So think of it this way. You've got 10 different tests of 10 different kinds of mental abilities, and you've got a correlation matrix. And these correlations are all positive, and they're all pretty substantial. And that could be anything from a correlation of 0.3 to a correlation of 0.9. So you've got all these different correlations among the 10 tests, and that matrix, how do you make sense of that matrix? Right. How do you parse that so you can kind of partition? By the way, Xavier, people should understand, I'm trying to explain complex things, and I'm going to simplify sometimes. So statisticians who say, that's not what factor analysis does. I know that's not what it does. Okay. But I'm trying to say what you're trying to do is to explain this correlation matrix and explain as much of the variance as you can with one factor. It's a process of coming up with explanations of the variance. And whenever you analyze sets of mental tests, you always get the first factor explains 50 or 60% of the variance. And that factor, when you look at what's going into it, is consistent with the idea of a general mental factor. The actual methods for factor analysis, I'm not even going to try. It's just too long.
Factor analysis, and I haven't done it properly, but my understanding of it is that everything you just said it tracks. And I think the biggest way I learned it is that you have all of these variables in the correlation matrix that are correlating. So if you're trying to look at something about, how does one thing correlate to the other? Well, you're trying to say, well, is this attributed because of, let's say, gender or race or age or SES, or there's all these variables that you're trying to understand what the correlation is. So you load things in or out, et cetera. And you're trying, it spits out based on the loading that you do, various eigenvalues, right? Which is basically what is the underlying principle here that we can confidently or mostly say, yes, this correlates with this, having factored in all of these different variables or factored out some of these variables. So that way you don't get as much noise of saying, well, we can be sure that this correlates with this, and it's not because of attrition, or it's not because of some exposure to the test, or et cetera. And so it's a way of trying to get at what is the underlying value, because most things are a multivariate problem and need multivariate solutions. It's never this kind of reductionistic, well, this is because of this every single time. And so you want to try and understand, okay, how do we do this? And so something like IQ, super complicated, super complex, a lot of things involved. And so factor analyses can be helpful to say, okay, well, how do we kind of parse out or tease out, what is connecting with what is basically how I kind of
Xavier, let me emphasize to everyone, factor analysis has nothing to do with causality.
Yes, right.
It is talking about the statistical structure of the matrix. And if one thing that people really drive me nuts on about not understanding overlapping distributions, the other thing is the incredible reluctance to talk about the existence of stuff independently of causes. And this is especially a problem in the current book, where I say at the very beginning, I am not talking about causes. I'm saying the existence of differences, for whatever reasons, has social implications. It is, well, I bet you're going to prove it, because unless you're unique among people I've ever talked to, it always leaks into the conversation because people are so concerned about, the causation issue.
Sure,
But
sure.
there is a distinction to be made between the existence of a phenomenon and its causation.
Yeah, I think most people would agree with that. I think I mean, we'll get to it, but it's strange where people later in the conversation kind of forget the preamble at first. And it's like, well, wait a minute, we already covered it. We said that this doesn't cause this. And so, people, they get, kind of animated about some things, which is understandable, but on some issues, but yes, it's not causation. And in many things, it's hard to say causation in actuality. Okay. So let's move to G real quick. So it's interesting. People still kind of dispute this. I know Gardner kind of, disputed this of sorts and everything, and people continue to maybe dispute it. But I think I still think the kind of party line here for most psychologists is G is a thing. It's real. We can measure it. And, the end kind of, there's more things to say about it. But so maybe just tell us, what is G? How do you explain it, and why it's important? And then, we can talk about why some people still dispute it.
The importance is predictive validity.
Mm-hmm.
If IQ tests did not have, if they were not usefully predictive, why would you bother to give one to anybody? It doesn't tell you anything. And so you gave IQ tests originally, or people invented IQ tests originally, because they wanted to identify intellectual talent among disadvantaged kids. In France, Binet, that was his motivation. Right. He wanted a test that would reveal someone's ability independently of the quality of their education, et cetera, et cetera. So predictive validity applied to classroom performance is important. The other major aspect is predictive validity with regard to job performance. Right. Because talk about meta-analyses, the most recent review of the literature on the relationship of IQ to job productivity wasn't a meta-analysis, it was a review of meta-analyses. I mean, it's been studied thousands of times. Yeah. So, but that has real economic consequences for an employer, for some jobs. And one of the things that Dick Ernstein and I did in the bell curve that I thought was the most fun, and it was actually Dick who did this, I just watched it with pleasure. He went through the arithmetic of how an employer can decide whether it's worth the cost to administer an IQ test. And it all depends on how much the person costs in salary and the relationship of productivity of an IQ score. And you can work it out. And for some jobs, if you're hiring particle physicists, it could be, and you can get somebody who's 4 standard deviations above the mean, yes. 3 standard deviations. That's worth it. But it's also true of accountants and other kinds of jobs. So predictive validity, G is the best available measure of cognitive ability. It's better than the raw IQ score, and it has the highest predictive validity. Now, one other thing I would add, you're right about the consensus among psychologists. The general public often, or at least the general public of a certain educated class, still thinks that Stephen Jay Gould destroyed the validity of G and factor analysis definitively back in 1982 or whatever. That book just caused rolling of eyes among psychologists when it came out. But since then, it's gone so far beyond that. And one interesting thing right now is neuroscientists are making huge strides in understanding the relationship both of different volumes of lobes of the brain and regions of the brain to G, and also of connectivity measures and things like that. And so if you want to say G isn't real, you've got to go tell the neuroscientists they're wasting their time, because in their opinion, this is the best way to validate whether they're learning anything.
Yeah, I think that for some people, they'll believe that, well, when you take an IQ test, and which we'll get into in a minute, it's just measuring how people just know how to take IQ tests. It's not really measuring anything. It's just a test that you're taking, almost like if people would think of it like an SAT or something like that, right? Yeah. And the thing with that is that we understand there's thousands of articles on this about G, is that there's at bottom something called G, which we understand as this general mental ability, that we understand that there's all these facets of it, right? All these components of how we understand intelligence. Again, it's a whole network of pieces, but at bottom, they're all contributing for this thing of how do we understand, and that's important because some of those things are, you talked about the predictive validity, which is obviously very important, and there's a lot of good data on predictive validity, but in many ways, that's what separates us from our chimpanzee and bonobo cousins, right? Is our mental abilities, right? And our IQ and how we're able to do things. And so we understand that we have things at bottom that are saying, this is intelligence, this is what it looks like for us. And there's different facets of it, which is fine. I don't think those are all a different intelligence, but it is something that it's all connecting. And you're right. I think that it's something that says, yes, we understand that for academic performance, and then also for how you're able to do work for various vocations, that your general mental ability is one of the primary ways to say how predictable you will be, or how good you will be or could be at a particular job. So exactly right. If you're trying to do physics, yeah, you'd want someone that's a genius. That makes sense. And so it's not the only thing for jobs, but it is, I think, the top thing.
It's not even close to the only thing. It's just of all the predictors, if you should have as much information about a prospective employee as you can get, but if you're limited to one thing, you're better off with an IQ score than you are with a job interview, with references, with GPA. Almost, you just go through the list of other things that employers use. The best single one is IQ. And by the way, you don't have to deal with cognitive ability as a one-size-fits-all phenomenon. You don't have to stick with the measure of G, because if you're hiring programmers for Microsoft, you're way more interested in visual spatial skills than you are in verbal skills. And so probably whatever tests you use or whatever interview questions you use, and believe me, Microsoft has some really cool interview questions that I've heard secondhand, you're really probing into certain kinds of mental ability. That doesn't mean they're uncorrelated.
Yeah.
But it does mean you can zero in sets that are more valuable for some vocations than other skill sets.
Well, and just to put a fine point on this, in any job that you're having, I would say, or most jobs, I should say, you obviously want to know a person's cognitive abilities. Again, not the only thing, because if you're doing work, if you take a loose definition of intelligence, it is, it's a kind of a mapping or a program in your mind, a model in your mind of trying to solve novel problems. That's what you're trying to do. I mean, that's what you're trying to understand. Here's a problem. How do I solve it? How do I make decisions? How do I organize it? That's a rough definition of what intelligence is. You would obviously want that of any sort for someone on a job. Hey, if you're flipping burgers, or you're, you're punching numbers, or you're a physician or a lawyer, you want to be able to try and solve problems on the spot. And you need everyone has IQ points, and you need to have some IQ points to do that. So it's not, this stuff doesn't seem to me too, not that intuitive of like, yeah, of course you would want that in a work environment. I think if there's any criticism here, people get, a little prickly about it because it's like, well, it's overemphasized, or what about all the other aspects? And you just said, and I'm saying, those are also super important. You gave an example of Microsoft of, you might want to emphasize visual spatial skills, and certain jobs are going to emphasize other things, but as a general heuristic, G and intelligence is important. It's very important. So let's get into, you had mentioned this in one of the emails, is this idea about norms on IQ tests. So we don't have to spend a lot of time on it. You already mentioned it, but let me just spit a few things out and just get your ideas about it. So for listeners, every intelligence measure is a complex system. They have usually 10 or 15 or many sub-tests that are trying to measure certain things. So just an example, the primary one, the WAIS-4, It's one of the major intelligence tests. It has 4 indices. It has verbal comprehension index, perceptual reasoning, processing speed, working memory. And there's all these tests that measure each of these things. When a test is created, it's normed, which basically means that it's a randomized sample where each person in the population has an equal chance of being selected. But many of these IQ tests have low sample relative to how it's measuring. So if you take a country like the United States, 330 million people, something like the WAIS 4, now the recent edition is coming out next year, so it'll be renormed, but at the moment, it was normed on 2,200 individuals. And I think when I looked at this, 10% of that were Black or African American, which would put it about, I guess, 200. How do we put reliance on some of these measures where it's like, well, how can we say some of these things or the performance if the general norms are on such a small number? Even 200 people out of so many, there's 40 million African Americans.
Maybe we don't.
Okay. So explain how we don't. Explain how we don't.
No, we've got other things. One is that suppose you've got 12 of these standardizations, each of which has the weakness of not that. By the way, the norms are not intended to provide accurate estimates of subgroups. Mm-hmm. The whole purpose of the norming process is to be sure that the new test conforms to the psychometric standards that are devoted for people in general. Yeah. So you can't blame the test organizations for not coming up with more reliable measures of subgroups, because that's not what they were trying to do. But having said that, if you have 12 such standardizations and the black-white difference ranges from 0.9 standard deviations to 1.2 standard deviations over those 12, you still don't know what the exact number is, but it's probably somewhere in the region of 1. Mm-hmm. But you also have some studies that are much larger. Mm-hmm. The National Longitudinal Study of the Department of Education in 1972 had a very elaborate IQ battery, and it had a sample of thousands of Blacks. Mm-hmm. National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, the 79 cohort and the 97 cohort, both had large samples. There are other large samples. So in the book, I think I have assembled, and it's downloadable for any listener. Go to encounterbooks.com, mm-hmm. and you can download the Excel spreadsheet that has all of the data I used to talk about the IQ differences. And you can look for yourself, but there's a lot of stuff out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's particularly instructive. I know sometimes people get worried about that. And so I think you're right in the aggregate, yes, one test, is not trying to be as representative. But when you're taking these big longitudinal studies and then you put them together, then you're able to say, oh, okay, there's more sample, a larger sample that we're pulling from. So that's helpful to know. Okay, so let's get into the meaty stuff here. So the term race, we don't have to spend too much time on this. I know people argue about this, and I kind of don't like arguments about terms all the time. But why do geneticists typically use population? Is race, does race actually map onto objective human variation, or if it is real, why is that not the consensus view? How do you understand this idea about the terms of how we use this? And I know it's kind of muddied, but how do you understand this?
I think the geneticists are correct to substitute population, because population can be defined as Sardinians. Mm-hmm. It can be defined as English. It can be defined as sub-Saharan Africans. You can define population according to your specific needs and so forth, as opposed to taking this catch-all thing called race, which isn't precise. And also, race simply has a great deal of semantic baggage that it carries with it. And why bring that into highly technical discussions of genetics? And so they talk about ancestral populations, and in human diversity, which deals with the genetics of this stuff, I exclusively use that as well. Mm-hmm. Having said that, it came as kind of a shock to people in the 1990s and 2000s to find out how closely genetics distinctions mapped onto self-identified racial and ethnic membership.
Mm-hmm.
So, and by quite accurate, there was an article, first author was a guy named Tang, T-A-N-G, in 2005, which had Latinos and whites and blacks in America. And the genetic markers they used corresponded to their self-identified ethnicity at the 98%. Mm-hmm. Incredibly accurate. But since that initial discovery, that's not news anymore. The continental ancestral populations do kind of correspond to race. You've got sub-Saharan Africa, you've got East Asia, you've got Europeans. Caucasian is kind of a weird racial term anyway, but you've got Europeans, you've got indigenous peoples of the Americas. Have I left out anybody? Anyway, these continental ancestral populations are genetically distinct. Now, by genetically distinct, I am referring to genetic markers, mm-hmm. which do not necessarily have any effect on the phenotype, a term that you use to, the phenotype is what you can see. Yep. The genotype is the genetics that underlie it. Yep. So to say that you can very accurately identify what ethnicity a person is, down to the level of Sardinians versus Welsh and English, doesn't mean that they are different in cognitive traits or behavioral traits or anything else, just as you can tell from the genetic variants. And here I've got to introduce a couple more bits of jargon.
Please.
One of them is SNP. It's capital S, capital N, capital P. Mm-hmm. And this is the label for genetic variants that can take more than one form. Mm-hmm. If you have a bit of genetic material, a base pair in the genome that has an effect on something, on a trait, but it only has one version, every human being in the world is going to have exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. But if it has two versions, they're called alleles.
Alleles, yeah.
Usually it's only two. And people who carry, let's say, allele A for a given trait, let's say that we're talking about schizophrenia, mm-hmm. and you have a SNP mm-hmm. That has an allele that jacks up by a very small percentage the probability that you're going to be schizophrenic. Mm-hmm. In that case, you have a thing called frequency, allele frequencies, which is a very common term that you ought to be familiar with. So that let's say that one population, you can define them however you want to, that 80% of the people carry allele A and 20% carry allele B, mm-hmm. and you have another population which is reversed. Mm-hmm. Well, you have a small difference in those two populations in their susceptibility to schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. And then you have the situation that has been discovered in the last 15 years, 20 years, which is that, guess what? There is not a gene for anything, except with very rare exceptions. Mm-hmm. Intelligence probably has thousands of SNPs that are associated. Right. Height has thousands. Height seems simple, but thousands of SNPs affect height. And the same thing goes with others. So what you're looking at when you're trying to distinguish among populations, or when you're trying to predict whether a person will have a trait, involves taking, trying to say this as simply as I can, taking the allele frequencies for all the known SNPs that bear on this and kind of adding them up. Mm-hmm. And you can do what's called a polygenic score. Right. So the polygenic score is based on genetic material alone. This is where you rank on your susceptibility to schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. Okay, that gets the terms out of the way that need to be introduced, because I'm going to come back to them in a minute.
Yeah. Okay. That tracks, and that's my understanding as well of how we understand these things. My understanding is that the SNPs, there's thousands that are implicated, and we can do the genome-wide association studies that can look at them. And many times it's telling you kind of what is, less so about how it all works out and how you're supposed to do something with it. It's just telling you kind of what is.
Exactly.
And doesn't tell you necessarily the mechanisms for things. It's just telling you how they kind of are there in a complicated outcome. So, okay, so maybe we'll come back to the terms. Okay, just I'll give you a little runway here. Kind of walk us through, and I know you've done this in other places, but here, just walk us through the main thrust of the differences in between group means in IQ between races. This is the most controversial thing. This is a thing that is, you've been talking about this for 30 years now. Just kind of give us what that is and what it looks like, and then we can keep going with it.
Sure. Point number one is that psychology is a field that is subject to all kinds of fads.
Mm-hmm.
You have self-esteem, which was supposed to be the great explainer of all sorts of problems of kids because they didn't have high self-esteem. You have stereotype threat, whereby women perform less well on tests if they feel threatened because of the stereotypes of female deficiencies. Or you can have racial stereotype threat. You have the implicit, the IAT, the
implicit association test,
bias, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
All of these fads, which when subjected to replication and examination, lie in smoldering ruins. Mm-hmm. I know that you still have self-esteem posters all over the schools. I know that you have stereotype threat that many people think explains all the differences between the sexes. But among the people who do the technical work, it has been deadly in terms of just not being able to replicate the initial claims that were made. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying about IQ is replicated to a fairly well. So here we go. With blacks and whites, for a long time, it has been argued in the technical literature that the difference between the two is a standard deviation. Mm-hmm. There are some eminent people who continue to argue that. I am part of another group of people who say no. Actually, it was wider than standard deviation back in the earliest evidence we have. It's my own assessment. This is not ironclad. I'm having to extrapolate from less complete data than I would like to. My best estimate is that probably the black-white difference in the 1940s was closer to 1.5 standard deviations than to 1. Mm-hmm. And even by the 1960s, there is pretty good evidence that it was well above 1, somewhere in the region of 1.2 to 1.25, something like that. And then it went down. Or at least that is my argument, and there are others who agree with that argument, that the IQ difference shrank. And the timing of it appears to me to be, if you judge it by when the test was administered, the mean difference between blacks and whites had gone down to the 0.8 to 0.95 range by the late 1980s. If you measure it in terms of when the people were born who took the test, kids born before 1973 were part of cohorts that were participating in the shrinking black-white difference. Kids born since 1973 have shown no difference. And so you have, overall with blacks and whites, you have, in my view, a shrinking difference up until 1970s, if you use the birth year. Since then, flat. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be true no matter whether you're talking about IQ tests or math and reading tests in the National Assessment of Educational Progress or a variety of other measures. There doesn't seem to have been a change since then. That's blacks and whites. The best estimate of the black-white difference now? Well, in facing reality, I bent over backwards to minimize it. And the reason I did that, and I said so openly, mm-hmm. and the reason I did it is I don't want to get hung up in conversations about whether I've overestimated the difference. I want us to talk about the social consequences of the number I'm going to give you. And the number I used is 0.85 standard deviations. I think that is an underestimate. I think it's probably closer to 0.9 to 0.95, maybe even higher. But it doesn't really make too much difference to me. The main point is it's been flat since, well, for over 30 years now. Now, Hispanics, Latinos. Latinos, of course, are a real melange in terms of ethnicity, all the way from Cubans who are 100% Spanish blood to indigenous tribes, Mayans, and so forth, who are 100% indigenous peoples, and a whole lot of mestizos, which is a mix of Europeans and Latinos. So
those are my peoples, the mestizos.
Okay, and you know what? You go to the census data, you have a very large number of Latinos who are listed in the census data as some other race besides white, black, Asian, and so forth. And I am quite confident the vast majority of those are saying, I'm mestizo. And that is at this point a distinctive ethnicity. Yeah. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable position. Having said, the reason I'm saying all this is the black-white difference is not nearly as problematic in terms of subgroups as I think the Latino difference is with whites, because I think if you could get good data on subgroups, you get very different results for different subgroups. In any case, that has been slowly declining, and it is now in the region of maybe 0.6 SDs, standard deviations, over the whole population. Then you come to the Asians. And
by Asians, we mean mostly East Asians, correct?
Mostly East Asians, although there are groups of South Asians, as Razib Khan will happily tell you, who do just fine, thank you very much, when it comes to this stuff. But East Asians, when we wrote the bell curve, Dick and I very tentatively said, well, it looks like Asians are maybe 3 or 4 IQ points higher, but the numbers were still pretty indefinite at that point. We have way better numbers now. And all the white supremacists who have tuned in to the show should realize whites are not on top. They aren't anywhere close to being on top. East Asians, I estimated in coming apart based on the tests given in the 2010s, Asians were looking like they were at a mean IQ of about 108. I think that could be too high, but that's what the numbers say for the last 10 years. And you certainly have seen just a growing distinction between East Asians and whites over the 20th, 21st century. And this is for East Asians in the United States, but also East Asians in Asia show the same elevated IQ. It is especially pronounced in visual spatial skills. And if you wonder why it is that you have so many programmers and so many people in IT among Asians, part of the reason is, and much more than you find disparities in percentage of lawyers among Asians, it's because there's a real strength there. I mean, I don't think you need IQ tests to prove that. As far as I'm concerned, any people that make up a written language as ferociously complex as written Chinese obviously have elevated visual spatial skills, because otherwise, how would they ever learn the thing? So those are the 3 major things. You have other groups that are extremely high. There are certain South Asian groups that score well above whites. The Parsi, a very small sect, lives in India, but they're actually Persian originally.
Yes.
Some people argue they have the highest mean IQ in the world. We don't have good enough data. Ashkenazi Jews, well established that they're maybe around 110, 112 mean, and that is that's pretty high. So you wanted a tour of the horizon of ethnic race differences. That's what it looks like.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So a few questions here. First, so just a clarifying point. In terms of IQ, we talk about ranges. And I think this is somewhat hard for people to understand. I've given plenty of intelligence tests many times in training and afterwards. And anytime I've done a feedback session, when I've done a psychological battery, and I will tell the person or the parent or whatever, and I'll say, okay, you're if the full scale IQ is valid, I'll say you're at 97 or 101 IQ. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means that you're average. You're in the average range, right? And everyone doesn't want to be average, right? It's like average is like, oh my gosh, you're a C student. That's not how intelligence works. Average is good. Average is right in the middle of the bell curve. You're humming along with most of the population, and you can get a decent job and you can be fine. Most people have an average IQ.
When what you just said is very important. It's not just they can get a decent job. They can get jobs that are really interesting, fascinating, satisfying, fulfilling. Yes. The idea that a high IQ is the open sesame to a much more exciting and fulfilling life than someone with an IQ of 100 is nuts.
Yes, yes. And so when we talk about Black Americans that have, again, a mean IQ as a group in the low 90s now, we'll talk about the Flynn effect in a minute, but have a low 90s, that's in the average range. When you talk about white Americans that have an IQ of, 103 or whatever it is, that is still in the average range. There's no difference in terms of the range, if you will, between whites and blacks. The difference is, okay, is it, kind of sort of the middle of that average range or the lower end? But the fact is that it's more or less closer within the middle of the bell curve. And then for Asians, it's obviously, again, the mean is higher. But so going back to the beginning, which is why we started this conversation with stats, people hear that and they think, so the average Black person walking around in my town has an IQ of 90? Like, what the hell? Or the white person that's walking around in my town has an average IQ of 102, 103? And that's not quite what it means. And so tell us, I guess, the differences between the groups and then the individuals, because people get confused with this.
Okay. First place, the people that you interact with in your neighborhood and your workplace and the rest of it probably bear no relationship to the national average. Because we are sorted into things inevitably by the nature of our choices of where to live and the choices of our jobs and so forth. Mm-hmm. And this, I think, is especially a problem for elite Americans, especially elite whites, who look around at their Black colleagues and say, hey, okay, or the Black neighbors, and say, these are really smart people. I mean, what are you talking about? Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, but Atherton, California, or the Upper East Side of New York is not your random selection of people. And so you are looking at a very skewed distribution, and it can go both directions. So what I'm trying to say is, in daily life, when you encounter in your milieu, whatever it may be, a Latino or a Black or a white or an Asian, you know even less about their differences than the national means would lead you to suggest. The mean IQ of the Latinos in your neighborhood is not the mean IQ for the nation as a whole. The same goes for whites and Blacks. Mm-hmm. So you just don't know. And in terms of your relationships with individuals, you've got to deal with them as individual people, mm-hmm. not just in a moral sense, as a moral obligation, but because it's nonsensical mm-hmm. for you to make judgments about the people in your life based on group names. Mm-hmm. Nonsensical.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's important. I think most people miss that. You saying that, and you've said a variant of that in other places. So I'm going to just jump to this question. So why the hell are we studying mean group differences between races then? You're saying all these things. Look, we got to treat people as individuals. You got to look at your neighbor. You got to look at people at your job. They're probably not going to fit in that, kind of bucket of these general mean IQs. So why the hell are we looking at this stuff? What's the importance of looking at it?
You were a little incorrect when you said a few minutes ago, I've been writing about this stuff for 30 years.
Okay.
I wrote about IQ in the bell curve with Dick Ernstein in 1994, but the book wasn't about that. It was a book. Yeah. I then subsequently had a kind of an article in the early 2000s in Commentary, and I published 2 technical articles in a technical journal, and that's it. And the rest of the books I've written have not dealt with this at all.
Mhm.
So why at the age of 78, 77, when I started the book, did I do this? And the answer is because we have painted ourselves into a corner if we are trying to oppose the critical race theorists, the identity politics that says this country is systemically racist. And here's Xavier, just give me a minute or two, because I'm actually telling you why I wrote the book.
Go ahead.
And I said at the beginning of the podcast that what we're facing now, I think, is an order of, it's qualitatively more serious than any other political crisis I have seen in my lifetime. And here's the reason. What makes America special is what used to be called the American Creed. That's not a phrase that somebody your age has probably ever even heard, but it was a very common use until maybe mid-century, mid-20th century. And it referred to a bunch of things, but essentially it was the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. All people are created equal, have the same innate human dignity. But most of all, that in the United States, you're going to be judged as an individual. Ideal. And did we fall short? Yeah. Many times, most previously, by not condemning slavery in the Declaration of Independence. But that's not really the point. The point is, first, we had huge successes. And second, abolitionism and first-wave feminism drew directly from that. And it goes all the way up to Martin Luther King's famous speech at the Lincoln Memorial. That's an evocation of the American Creed from beginning to end, right down to the iconic final line, or near the final. Once his daughter is judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, treated as individuals. Identity politics, which is now, as far as I can tell, the reigning ideology of the progressive left, repudiates that ideal. And it says, no, America is systemically racist. And because it is systemically racist, it is not only okay for the government to treat people as groups, it is morally obligated to treat people as groups, providing benefits to those who are the good guys and providing penalties to those who are the bad guys. And the challenge narrative that I listened to last summer in the New York Times and the Washington Post and all the major news media, the unchallenged narrative was, what else could it be? We still have differences in policing in minority communities. We still have too few minorities in prestigious occupations. We have income differentials. At 60 odd years after the Civil Rights Act, what else can it be but systemic racism? The answer to that question requires us to talk about group differences that provide a non-racist explanation for a great many of the problems that are used as the evidence for systemic racism. And particular, two group differences have to be confronted. And the first involves crime, which we haven't talked about at all. But I'll just say it very quickly. You want to know why there are different outcomes in policing? Well, there are a lot of reasons, including some racist cops, no question about that. Also, the environment in which police work when they are in a low-income Black community is completely different from the environment in which they work if they're in a middle-class white community. The rate of Black offenses and serious violent offenses, depending on the city, in the major cities is around 10 times the white rate. And if that happens, you will have police behaving professionally and responsibly, but responding to the environment around them, and you will see a lot of the problems that we see. Xavier, let it be understood. Am I saying it's okay for cops to shoot people in the back as they walk away from them? No, I am not. I guess I am saying this, though. An awful lot of cops have body cameras on them.
Right.
And if there were some way that you could see all of the video of the days of cops with body camera on, you're going to see thousands of examples of every day of cops exhibiting enormous restraint in the face of obscenities being shouted at them, enormous restraint in using physical force when it's putting themselves in a certain degree of danger, and that these outnumber the videos go viral by I don't know how many. Okay, so that's the first thing that we need to talk about the race difference in violent crime if we're going to talk about policing. And if we're going to talk about differences, remaining racial differences in income and occupations and so forth, we got to talk about the difference in cognitive ability. You adjust for that, you control for cognitive ability, and the income differentials go way down. In some cases, they reverse. So why do we have to talk about it? Because if we want to say, if we want to restore as the American ideal shared by the Democratic and Republican Party, that in the United States you are judged for who you are, not the membership of your group. If we want to save that, we got to talk about this stuff.
So I follow your reasoning here. I have a few questions about this. The first question is, so on the one hand, you're saying we have to look at people as individuals, and we have to look at them as for who they are and all of these things. But then on the other hand, you say, but then we have to look at all these group differences for crime and cognitive ability. So then I would wonder, how are you saying we have to do both? We have to look at people as individuals and we have to look at their group differences, or how do we make those two connect, I guess, in some way? How do you square that, I guess?
Well, we're looking at the social consequences of the group differences. They connect insofar as we are now obligated, in some cases legally, and in other cases because of cultural norms, to treat people as groups. Mm-hmm. And I am referring to aggressive affirmative action. Mm-hmm. By aggressive affirmative action, the original affirmative action said to employers, you aren't even reaching out to populations of Blacks that might be suitable for your company. You get publicity out there saying you got job openings. When you interview a Black candidate, if you're looking at two candidates who are just about a coin flip, then give the nod to the minority. That was the original way of thinking of affirmative action. Aggressive affirmative action is to say, you go ahead and you hire Blacks that you wouldn't quite qualifications, and or you admit to schools. And by the way, this isn't government sponsored. The universities are doing this voluntarily. You admit students to the school that you wouldn't admit if they were white. So we have, for cultural reasons of public policy, requirements to treat people as groups. It is, I'm increasingly convinced of this, it is the fundamental cause of a great proportion of the racial tension in the country. It has been going on for 60 years. You have had 60 years of a lot of whites being kind of quietly resentful of this, but not wanting to make a fuss, and also sort of wanting to do the right thing. And, you know, supporting affirmative action is supposed to be the right thing. And the result has been that we are not treating people as individuals now. And by we, I mean whites. Mm-hmm. We are treating minorities as groups. Okay. I am saying we need to go back to treating them as individuals in our personal lives. And we also need public policy to shift so that the government once again becomes impartial in terms of the laws with respect to race. That you do not have laws, programs, incentives, and the rest of it that help out one race and don't help out another race. Mm-hmm. So I am arguing that we must once again treat people as individuals. I am saying that we have strayed from that we are treating people as groups. And the reason that this creates such problems is because there are group differences. And so if you start to treat people as groups, you propagate the problem. Here, let me give a specific example of this.
Sure.
Let's say you have, well, you do have for the black-white difference of 0.9 SDs, let's say. Mm-hmm. And there is no reason for that same difference to characterize the students at Princeton mm-hmm. or Northwestern or this University of Iowa. Mm-hmm. There is no reason that needs to be. If you don't have to propagate the difference that exists in the population as a whole into your school. You can simply say, we're just going to admit people who we think are the best choices on academic grounds and other holistic measures, but we aren't going to include race among those. And if that were the case, the difference in academic ability of the people who got into the schools would not be 0.9 standard deviations with blacks and whites. It would be trivial, very small. And the same thing could also be true of corporations. That is not, in fact, what has happened. Whether it's because the universities think this is the socially just thing to do, or whether it's because corporations are afraid of the EEOC, for whatever reasons, you have taken the differences that exist in the population as a whole and transmitted them throughout the educational system, not only in undergraduate, but through graduate schools, medical schools, law schools, the rest of it. And in occupations, you now have a situation in which the mean IQ of K-12 teachers is about a standard deviation difference separating blacks and whites. Same is true of nurses, same is true of accountants, same is true, you go through all the occupations. That doesn't need to be. Uh-huh. It is an artificial result of treating people as groups because people have been unwilling to talk about real group differences.
That's interesting. I don't think I've heard you maybe explicitly state it that way. So let me see if I can
there's a reason for that.
Let me see if I can capture this.
No, I know. I'll tell you, Xavier, over the last couple of months since the book came out, mm-hmm. I have become less and less restrained in saying how pissed off I am about mm-hmm. the situation that we have created. And mm-hmm. So I am saying it somewhat differently and more boldly to you.
That's fine. I want you to speak your mind. I guess so here's how I understand it. You're saying that if we get back to the business of treating people as individuals, with an understanding of what the group differences are at the moment, treating more people as individuals will then start to narrow the disparities between groups.
Within occupations or within schools, yes,
within those categorizations. So you could spend all day countering back and forth, and that's not my entire aim. But I guess my biggest thing is the counter I can hear is, well, look, yes, we should treat people as individuals, but people by nature, we're social mammals. We are groupish. We do operate in groups. You could do that as, I'm a male, so with other dudes. I'm in a certain age bracket. I have a certain orientation or whatever. We are groupish by, if I go to a party and I don't know anybody there and someone that somehow looks like me or talks like me or connects with me or something more often than not, I might gravitate towards that person. Like, oh, you're from this part of the country? Yeah, me too. And that might be different than someone that's from North Dakota, let's say. And then nothing wrong with people from North Dakota, but I have a connection. There's a group. And I think that I hear what you're saying. And what I hear from you that maybe might be hard for other people, but if I take the most charitable view of what you're saying is you're concerned and you're worried about, your country, my country, just as much as anybody else may be. And you want people to not be dismissed or anybody to be dismissed based on grouping or categorization that they can't control. And you would much rather elevate their intellectual and their individual differences and say, look, this is what makes you you, and this is what makes you you, and let's really try and get at that and understand that. And I agree with the spirit of that. I guess the thing is that it doesn't negate the fact, though, that people are also part of groups too. They are part of groups, whether we like it or not, or we agree with it, or. And I understand that you have concerns about the overemphasis of looking at people within groups. I hear that. I hear that. So how can we have both, I guess? Or can we have both in a way where it's like, yes, I'm an individual, but I'm also an individual that's part of a few groups as well. And there's some value to that. I don't, again, overemphasizing or only emphasizing your group membership, I don't think is very prudent to do. And in your way, you feel maybe very dangerous. But it doesn't mean that it's entirely wrong to do or bad to do. How do we square these two things?
It comes down to separating what we do in our private lives from what we do in our public lives, which I don't think is that hard.
Uh-huh.
I think the tendency you talk about wanting to be around people with whom we're comfortable, and that's partly based on group membership, is just a statement about human nature.
Mm-hmm.
And it's completely natural. And it has led to more segregation, certainly socioeconomic segregation, than I would prefer, because I think some people are, as I've written in a book called Coming Apart, particularly among the elites, are living in bubbles that are completely atypical. Yeah. But I get that, I share that, and all the rest. And that's in our private things. But that doesn't mean that if I'm an employer, it's so hard for me in interviewing a candidate to say, I really shouldn't prefer this candidate over that candidate because his dad went to the same high school I went to. Yeah. It's not that hard to say to yourself, I got to try to avoid that. And it's certainly not that hard to say, gee, I don't have that many Black people in my neighborhood, and here's this Black candidate for the job. It would be wrong for me to not want to give a job to this guy because he's Black. In terms of the way we interact with people in our professional lives, or for that matter, in social interactions when we're shopping in stores, or when we are interacting with police, or when we are doing all sorts of other things, it's not that hard for us to say, in this sphere, it's wrong for me to think in terms of the good guys versus the bad guys as defined by my group. But Xavier, you have raised what for me is the deadly threat. And I've got it in the book, because in the last chapter, and I don't know how persuasive I was. I didn't persuade John McWhorter, and he's a really smart guy, and some other people. But here's what I'm saying. Right now, we have with identity politics, mainly there is some Latino identity politics going on. Believe me, I'm not saying this because you're Latino. I don't sense I don't sense it's nearly at the same level of tension that the CRT story is. It's mostly Blacks and whites, and you have this situation where 13% of the population is calling 60% of the population, because that's the proportion of non-Latino whites. Evil, racist, oppressive, guilty, and they need to shape up because they are culpable. And you have millions and millions of whites who are saying, I got Black colleagues at work, and I treat them with respect and friendship, and I don't think of myself as a racist. I don't think I behaved as a racist. You have many millions more whites who are saying, wait a minute, I live in a town where it's 90% white, and this whole issue doesn't even really come up. And what I'm afraid of is that you're getting a very large, to coin a phrase, silent majority of whites, I don't know what the size of the number is, who are saying, I've had it. The hell with this. You guys want to play the race card? I can play the race card. I'm white. White's a race. White's an identity too. And that way lies catastrophe. I'm not being hyperbolic.
Yes.
If you have whites, and they will be concentrated in the red states, who are start to think of, well, public policy, we need to start defining that in terms of what's good for whites. They haven't done that yet. I think the potential is out there for doing that. I think that you tend to have political possibilities filled by demagogues who are willing to trade on that. I think our experience since 2016 has shown us how susceptible we are to demagogues.
Yeah.
And so you are not only right about the way that we naturally gravitate toward our own tribe, you are so right that given the current narrative that the elites are supporting fully, the potential for a terrible backlash is real. And by the way, the white elites have been incredibly silent about any criticism of the systemic racism charges. I don't know. I mean, I hang out with conservatives, and being that that's my tribe, or libertarians, or whatever we are. There aren't very many of us anymore. But so I hear some criticism of it, but you just simply do not come across in the pages of the Wall Street Journal, and not even the Wall Street Journal, and certainly the Washington Post, New York Times, and NBC, CBS, and PBS, etc. You just don't come across anybody saying, "Hey, folks, let's just back off from the systemic racism stuff, because actually there are explanations for these disparities that don't imply racism." I don't hear any of that at all.
Well, I want to say this. I want to respect your time, so I have just a few more quick questions just to kind of wrap things up here. I guess the one thing that, at some point we didn't mention it, but I want to just kind of get it out there. I know that you've written and other people have written about the genetic components of this race difference in IQ. Most people agree is 30 to 60%. And so that leaves at least, 40 to 70%, social or environmental. And I guess you just wonder, a lot of times these kind of debates come into kind of camps. You're hereditarian, or you're, social constructionist, or environmentalist. And I just don't understand, why don't people talk about both kind of at the same time enough? It's like, yes, there's some genetic pieces and the gene interaction with environment, okay? And then there's environmental social pieces, and that's a thing, and that's going to be different for everybody. Why do we get into these kind of camps of like, this or this, and it's an either or thing? Isn't it better, if it's true, to talk about both in that way, to say, yes, there's a component of biology, a component of your environment, what your interaction is, how you have variation in development, etc. Wouldn't you agree that that's important to do holistically, I guess?
Absolutely. And I can be a little bit optimistic about this, because I think that the social sciences have become extremely corrupt. I mean,
there's some problems for sure.
Corrupt is the only word for it. People are self-censoring themselves. They are saying things they don't believe. Sometimes they're publishing findings that I can't make myself believe they believe. But the good news is that the progress in genetics is so rapid.
Yeah.
And it has so much relevance to so many social science topics, that I think within a reasonably short number of years, let's say over the course of this decade, people are going to be incorporating genetic information into their social science analyses. It's already started.
Yeah.
Catherine Hardin is a psychologist at the University of Texas at Austin. She's just published a book, and she makes repeatedly playing an ardent social democrat and saying,
Mm-hmm.
but it's okay. We can be an ardent social democrat and still incorporate this stuff. And I'm perfectly happy with that. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, I'm especially happy when social scientists sort of declare their political
Yeah.
position. Um, well, there are all sorts of others that are starting to do that, and polygenic scores
Mm-hmm.
are increasingly becoming so useful. They aren't going to substitute for IQ scores anytime soon, but they're really useful. And it seems to me unlikely that by 2030, you will be able to submit an article to a major technical journal in which you do a regression equation trying to predict poverty based on socioeconomic status of the parents without incorporating genomic information. Because if you do try to do that, if you try to do analyses that are exclusively environmental, at that point people say, oh, you can't do that. You got to incorporate the gene environment interactions and all the rest of it. The methodologies for understanding the gene environment interactions are improving every day, every month anyway. There are new articles coming out all the time that are more sophisticated than this. Now, a lot of my friends say, good luck with that. The orthodoxy, the academic orthodoxy is too powerful. They are never going to buy into this. You stop and think about it. How long have the social scientists or the non-scientists been able to resist incorporating major scientific findings? I mean, genomics is at the point, is rapidly reaching the point when there are a bunch of things that are going to be incontestable.
Mm-hmm.
And the virtue of this is not going to be that we'll prove how much of the black-white difference in IQ is genetic. The good news in all of this is that it will get us back to a much more realistic way of modeling social outcomes if you're a social scientist. So, you're absolutely right in saying that the people should not lock themselves into environmental or genetic explanations because they're neither one of them realistic.
Yeah.
The good news is that we're making progress in doing that, I think.
Yeah. Two final questions here. The next question I have is, how do people that are kind of more on the hereditarian or the kind of strict heritable kind of side of things? There's a reality that there is a history of eugenics in intelligence research, in stats research, and there are a lot of not so good groups currently that use a lot of this data for pretty nefarious intentions to say, see, the data says this about these differences, and they use it very negatively to be, quite frankly, racist and bigoted and xenophobic, and that does get used. I mean, many of these groups will look to geneticists and they'll look to psychologists and they'll look to folks doing this type of research and say, see, there's hard science behind this. We can't avoid this. And then they'll make very grotesque claims about kind of the valuation and topspin they put on it. How do you, two parts to this, what do you say to that kind of stuff? And second, are there just some things when they kind of get out of academia or they kind of, get into the popular sphere of things that it just starts to get twisted and mangled and really, really tough to kind of close the lid on it? So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, people will misuse it.
Mm-hmm.
There is no way to talk about these issues and say, oh, there's no downside.
Mm.
Everybody's going to be reasonable because I have written about these issues with such nuance and kindness and inner humanity that people will realize we don't need to run screaming from the room at all this, that it's not all that bad. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. The people will run with this. And I will simply put it this way. The same thing has happened on the environmentalist side of there are no genetic differences at all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the infamy that I acquired in the bell curve, from the bell curve, was the result of one sentence in one paragraph.
Yeah.
In which Dick Herrnstein and I said that we could not exclude either environmental or genetic explanations, that both are probably involved to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
That was the entire statement we made about the genetic role, and you know what the reaction was.
Yeah.
Well, that has gone on, so that if you say, well, could be probably is a genetic component to this day. And you will get reaction to this program saying exactly this.
Yes.
This is racist, this is evil, this is wrong. We know this is wrong, this is pseudoscience. Get the calipers out, it's phrenology.
Yeah.
It has been just as extreme. And because of that kind of extremism, you have a situation which has made it very hard for people of goodwill to say anything. And I guess I will use the example of poor David Reich, a Harvard professor, an eminent geneticist who's done path-breaking work, just seminal work in ancient DNA.
Mm-hmm.
And in an op-ed piece in the New York Times a couple of years ago, he had a very mild-mannered statement about people should not dig themselves into a corner, saying there cannot be any genetic differences because there will be some that are going to be found, and it's not disaster, but let's not keep on saying they can't exist. He took terrific pushback on that, terrific
Mm-hmm.
criticism,
Mm-hmm.
and for such a mild statement as that. So what we need at this point is an open discussion by people of goodwill of what the situation is, and we can argue back and forth,
Mm-hmm.
and we will have on the sidelines, on both sides of the field, people we don't want to be associated with who are saying he's right.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it is. But to react to that saying, well, we'll just go on with what we've been doing all along, we'll pretend to ignore all this stuff, has proved, I think, to be disastrous.
Yeah, and you mentioned Catherine Page Harden, who's got a new book out, and I think she's one of these people that she is a good faith person. She comes with good faith. She's trying to speak honestly about the science and the literature, and say how do we have nuance and how do we understand it.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
And then so you had somebody like Razib Khan, who is, I guess you'd call him a hereditarian, which to me means he's being sensible. Razib said the politics, he doesn't agree with, but the science is right. Mm-hmm. And that's possible. You can have people with very different political views who can come to an agreement about what the science is telling us. Yeah. And we ought to grasp onto that straw and try to make it. I'm going to mix my metaphors, but
yes, I got you.
Try to push that.
Last question for you. It's a two-part. You've been called a lot of things. You've been called a racist. You've said you believe that black people are inferior to white people. You've been called a bigot, xenophobic, eugenicist, pseudoscientist. Been some pretty strong things hurled at you. How do you feel about that? Would you ever say like, yeah, well, that's true, or yeah, what do you want to say? Like, no, that's not true, or do you care, or what do you feel about that? What do you want to say to some of those things that are claimed about you, and where people can really just hear what you're trying to say? But what do you say when people make those claims against you?
Well, if you were asking me in the first few months after the bell curve came out, you'd have gotten one 9 years ago, no, 27 years ago. Mm-hmm. And within about a couple of years after that, I don't mean to make light of it. And I feel especially sad when people who are close to me decide that I'm a bad guy. And that has happened. And that I feel bad about. But the rest of it, I live very quietly and in a town with loving family and great neighbors, and I work at a great place where I have wonderful colleagues. So I have nothing to complain about.
Any last words? You've been so generous with your time talking to me about all this stuff, really hard stuff you talked about numerous times.
You know what? I will say this,
Hmm.
that I have done a lot of discussions with a lot of people about the book. And as I said to you earlier, as time has gone on, it's sort of as if what I really think about this has gotten distilled.
Mm-hmm.
And my sense is that I've done a better job of expressing all of that in our 90 some minutes
Mm-hmm.
than I've done before. And that's to a great extent thanks to the way you've conducted the conversation. So thanks very much.
You're much too kind. I greatly appreciate that. For folks that are interested, Facing Reality, Two Truths About Race in America. It's the newest book from Charles Murray. Sir, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and your insights. I appreciate the perspective greatly. And I'll see you soon, hopefully.
I hope so too.
All righty.